I'm Owen Vallis, Professor of Music Technology at California Institute of the Arts. We've been building a synth using blocks in the new Reaktor 6. Let's take a look at how we can add an effect and further modulate parameters in each of the blocks. To start, let's go see what we have available to us for effects. Again, under the Reaktor Blocks menu here on the left, we can go down and we see a wide selection of blocks, which we will load and take a look at each of these. But to start, what we're looking for here are the ones called rounds. This is essentially a reverb and a delay. We're going to grab the reverb here, pull it over, and again, it's as simple as taking the output signal, routing it to the input, and then routing the output of our reverb to our speakers. And in fact, it's getting a little crowded here with this split view, so I'm going to go to the top right here and switch our view. This split panel view allows us to see the structure up above and the control panel below. Let's also rearrange our structure a little bit. We know the reverb comes last, so we'll move that to the right. But which of these two envelopes are controlling the amplitude and which one is controlling the filter? If I click on this one, we can see that this amplitude envelope becomes highlighted. If I click on this one, we can see that this one has become highlighted. So we want to grab this and move it to the left of the filter. This now makes it clear that our oscillator goes into the filter, which is controlled by this envelope, and that this volume control here is controlled or modulated by this envelope over here, and that the entire signal path goes through our reverb. The next thing we want to do is let's take a look at some of the individual parameters in these blocks. This oscillator here can take on many different waveform shapes. Once we get over here to this square wave, we have the ability to change the pulse width. We can see that it sounds quite muted because we had previously applied a lot of modulation to this cutoff. Let's reduce that modulation now, and in fact, let's pull down the cutoff and make the filter sweep up when we hit a note. We would like that note to come back down, so we're going to go ahead and turn the sustain back. Now when we play the note, this modulation here will sweep up and sweep back down. It's a little fast, so we'll go ahead and slow down the decay, slow down the attack, and we have the ability to click on these and change the shape of the envelope. This is a linear line here, and while useful, sometimes we want a curve applied to our control. This sounds more musical. But what I really suggest is just exploring them. They can be used in many different contexts, and as we will see later, some of these shapes are very useful for creating punchy percussion sounds. What we'd like to do now is create this kind of bend or exponential curve to our envelope. We would like to do something similar for our amplitude envelope here, but we can see that down here on the left we have some choices. We can make it linear or exponential. This refers to how the knob controls the volume. So let's hear what it sounds like when I turn the knob when it's set to exponential. I could turn it with the mouse, but I can bring up the contextual menu and tell it to MIDI learn, and now this will map it to my controller. So if I turn up the knob here, we can hear that it's a smooth decay. As I go up to the full volume, it gets louder, and then as I turn it down, it decays away very nice and smoothly. It feels like there's control over the volume over the entire range of the knob. If I switch it to linear and do the same thing, we will hear how in the beginning it feels like the volume jumps up, and then there's not as much control over the remainder of the knob. So generally speaking, we want our knobs to have this kind of exponential control over the sound. So then this brings up the question, how should we set up our envelopes? Well, again, I suggest just playing with the different settings and going with whatever feels right and sounds right. However, we could take a linear envelope like this and pass it to this exponential knob and get something that sounds quite nice. Again, let's apply our modulation back. If I switch it to linear now we have a linear knob being controlled by the linear envelope. And we hear that it just turns on very quickly. If I lengthen the decay and the release, this will exaggerate that. So there's this kind of thing where it just dropped off there at the end. When I put it back to exponential, there's that smooth decay where it goes to silence. And again, this is just a preference. So play with these different settings. Feel free to click on these, and whatever sounds good is where you should set it. The other button we want to talk about here is this DC and AC. The way this works is, if we have audio that we want to pass to the speakers, generally we want to click AC. This essentially removes any offset in your waveform. So if your waveform was biased and more positive than negative, turning this on would recenter it around 0. However, if we have a control signal, something like an LFO that only goes between 0 and 1, then we would want to leave this DC setting on, which would allow us to pass these biased signals through. Again, AC should be for our speakers, and DC generally is for our control signals. Lastly, I want to take a look over here and talk about the reverb. The reverb uses a bunch of diffusion delays and creates a very nice sound. We have the usual controls here, such as wet and dry. We can kind of tailor the feedback sound, the amount of feedback in the system. The size knob changes the perceived size of the reverb. Same thing with the diffusion, increases the diffusion or, well, the diffuseness of the reverb, but can make the room sound tighter. Spread should make it sound wider. And the center knob affects the shape. Let's hear what it sounds like as we play with some of these parameters. And what we want to notice here is the change in pitch as we change the size parameter. This would be an interesting parameter for us to modulate. So let's take one of our envelopes and begin to modulate this parameter slightly as we play the synth. Again, we can take the output of either one of these. We'll take the one that we're using to control the filter and pass it into the modulation A input on our reverb. Clicking on the A up top here allows us to apply some of this modulation to the size. And now when we play, we should hear that change in pitch, which adds a nice amount of color to our sound. At this point, we're pretty close to that synth that we had originally brought up. So let's bring up the original one and just do a quick review to see what we've built. Here we can see we had the same modules. I chose for a more aggressive attack sound, but we have the same routing for this modulation here. Same routing into modulation here. And again, we can go through and change our oscillator sound. We haven't really talked about these FM and sync inputs, but we will look at those in a later video. And essentially, I've assigned all of these to knobs on the keyboard. This makes it very easy to play and be expressive with your synth. So let's just check out what this sounds like. So we can see how very quickly we can create a synth that is custom, very expressive, easy to play, and most importantly, works the way you want it to work. In later videos, we're going to explore more advanced synthesis techniques, such as FM synthesis and adding sequencers. This allows us to create an entire system that can be performable and playable from within Reaktor. But we'll also take a look at how we can load these synths that we build into a digital audio workstation like Ableton or Logic. Be sure to check out cadenze.com if you want to learn more about Reaktor and how to build your own custom synths.